in Novato and a very accomplished and wonderful professional garden photographer. And he will be sharing images from a recently published book, Gardening in Summer Dry Climates. And this also relates to an ongoing project that he is conducting to document, to illustrate plants for summer dry climates in California. And tonight he will emphasize those from California, so California natives that are suitable for our gardens here. So please welcome Saxon.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll now.
Okay.
Thank you, Kristen. While Anne's closing out the poll, I'm going to see if the screen sharing works as we want it to do. I'll share my screen and see if my presentation starts right up. And I hope you can see that. I'm still seeing, there we go. I had to hide the board notes. I'm going to interrupt my scheduled presentation to talk about a recent trip I did around California to document all the dry reservoirs. We all know the crisis. As a photojournalist, I wanted to see it for myself and get pictures so that I could have a reference point for later and to share to people to show how bad it truly is. The photos I've been seeing didn't show it as bad as it is. I'm not going to waste the 1 hour I have a presentation by talking too much about all of this. I'm going to race through them. But this is San Luis Reservoir down in Merced County. These were taken 3 weeks ago before the recent rains. At this point, this reservoir was 16% full. I'm trying to advance. There we go. That's that same reservoir. You see, it's an earthen dam on the right. That's a wider view of it. It's just drying up. As the water recedes, the moisture's gone. We just see the caked earth. And where we can see how San Luis Reservoir fits within the larger landscape there of Merced County. Hoover Dam and Lake Mead, it's not in California, but because this does run into Southern California, the rain, the Colorado River watershed goes into Lake Mead, and then from the Hoover Dam, it goes into California. These are like some of the pictures I had been seeing of Lake Mead. You see the bathtub ring, but it's impossible to really see the scale. That's 140 feet of receding there. It's hard to tell that in pictures. So that's why I wanted to go around the lake itself and see other regions of it and see area. It's just totally dry. Where you see those bathtub rings in the photos by the dam, it's a deep canyon, the Colorado River Canyon at that point. So you don't really get a sense of how flat and how dry the whole area of Lake Mead is. It's just totally, it's not totally dry. It's, I think, 34%. I think most people say Lake Mead will never be full again. It was last full in 1999. But since that time, not only has the climate gotten warmer and the watershed drier, there's been more demands on the Colorado River through Arizona, populations in Las Vegas, Southern California agriculture. There's a lot more demand on this lake, so it probably never will be full again. This is a Pine Flat Reservoir. There's the dam itself. They are required to keep a release flow from it. So this is the Kings River. There is still some flow in it, and it's really beautiful below the dam. But once you go on the other side of the dam, you see this reservoir is 19% full, or 3 weeks ago. And Pine Flat is just east of Fresno. So I don't know if it's had a lot of rain, but they're all desperately low, despite whatever rains we may have had recently. Another shot from Pine Flat. This is Lake Oroville. Lake Oroville was in the news. A lot of you may remember a few years ago, it was so full, it was starting to break, and they had to have emergency releases from it. Now this is, say 3 weeks ago, it was about 34% full. A lot of bare earth all around Lake Oroville. Shasta, when I took this, I found a nice view that showed the mountain way in the distance. Shasta, as far as I've heard from people, has not been totally bare of snow in recent memory. I would love it if someone here could correct me, but I don't think it's been totally bare in a long time. And you can see beyond, Shasta itself is really low. A number of the boat docks are totally isolated now. They have added access by just bulldozing, some of the boat access. You can get into the lake, but it's really dry. Okay, enough of that. I'll, I'll get started on why I came, but I thought you guys might be interested in that, in what I saw there. But really, I'm here to talk about the Summer Dry Project, my new book, and really this gives me an opportunity to talk about climate tolerant gardening for the entire Pacific region, not just for the California. And I like to talk about this as not being a drought tolerant talk. It's not about Mediterranean garden, it's climate tolerant gardening. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about it. Some of you may know the old book that I did about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago now, for East Bay Mud. That book is now out of print. So as part of the Summer Dry Project, we wanted to have the new book. And those of you who know the old book as gardeners, the new one isn't an exact, not an exact replica. It's updated with new plants and new charts and maps, but it's the same concept. It's basically a plant book and showing plants in garden settings, so you have an idea of sort of how they might operate. Here I am in Novato. This is Mount Burdell State Park in a good year. This particular buckeye tree, one of my favorites because it's a rosy tinged one. But this past year, the climate is so dry. We had a total of 8.75 inches all last winter. 2 weeks ago, we had 8 inches, but all of last year, it was so dry that the buckeyes were losing their leaves the same time they were flowering. It's really, really stressed, and I'll be anxious to see, what recovery there may be. But we'll see. But I really don't want to talk too much about the dystopia of climate change. I think we all know the climate's changing really quickly. I think we just heard about the latest United Nations report saying we're in a red alert. So really, I think it's really time for us to get to work. And recently, I've been reading, I'm a gardener, so I keep up with gardening trends, and I've been reading the work of a landscape architect, Kate Orff, who works for the Scape, a design firm in New York City. They're doing some monumental task of re-engineering landscapes, including the Mississippi River, whether they're changing the levees to reduce flooding, and they're reworking Brooklyn estuaries with reefs of living oysters. Will there help storm surges. But to her, climate change is a cause for a better world. She says, we have to reset the button we want, and nature will come back. And I think that's what really resiliency is all about. And it's why it shapes my work. I know many of you know Doug Talamy. He is an entomologist on the East Coast. He's done a number of great books about gardening. First one that caught my eye was Bring Nature Home. This quote is from his most recent one, called Nature's Best Hope. Nature's best hope is a garden. And I think it's, as he says here, it's tempting to think about gardening for beauty without regarding the many ecological roles that our landscapes must perform. I suspect most of us here this evening already understand that, but it's my job as a photojournalist to find and present a holistic type of garden and help redefine what we see that's normally presented in the media as a new beautiful. And in the book, there are lots of summer dry regional climates in the West, and we'll show that in the book. They're all the way from Baja to BC. I'm going to connect these climates with maps across the globe, but fundamentally, they all have dry climates, not drought, predictably dry. We don't expect it to rain in the summer. That's our climate. And for our gardeners, we want climate tolerant plants. I'm having difficulty advancing my slides at this point. There we go. Kristen introduced my work as not just the book. It really is the most recent part of it. We do have a website, summerdry.com. There we have a monthly newsletter, goes out about plants and gardening tips. We have a really fun Instagram account. There are followers all over the world. It's sort of fun to see what's happening in Mallorca or Australia. And this is fun. I put 3 or 4 new photos every week up there. There tend to be plants for summer dry climates. But most importantly, part of the Summer Dry project is our working with the WUCL's database. Those of you who are gardeners may know WUCL's. It's the state of California's official database of all plants that are sold in California, and they're rated for water use classification. So the landscape firms and larger municipalities who want to know if a new garden is going to be water efficient, they require what's called the MWELO, the Model Water Efficiency Landscape Ordinance. You have to follow this ordinance to have a permit to do larger gardens. And in that process, you have to use plants that are rated for water in the WUCL's database. Unfortunately, the database was originally created just for the trade and didn't have plant descriptions or photographs. So that's part of what we want to make the database more useful. Because it is the official database for plants sold in California, it ought to be a lot more useful. So that's really part of that whole project. But back to what the Summer Dry project is in general, it's we believe every act we do adds resiliency. And I don't want to get into dystopian worries about, we know climate is changed. Resiliency is about adapting to it and how we adapt to it. There are a lot more conversations we can have as native plant people about assisted migration, about habitat. But as a gardener, my job is to help people understand we do have a way forward with resiliency. With the book, we just divided the whole West Coast into 4 regions in order to be adaptable. As any gardener knows, there are numerous microclimates, but we picked 4 regions and tried to pick a ecotype from each one. All gardeners must look to the local ecologies in order to get inspiration. We have these 4 in the Southern California in the upper left, Torrey Pine State Park, in the right, upper right, Central California, represented by Carrizo Plains. The bottom left is here, Mount Burdell and Marin, and the bottom right is Camasia State Reserve outside of Portland. And I think it's really, for this audience, I'm not telling you anything new, that in order to garden, we must look to the native habitats and see what's thriving there. Not just what's living, what's thriving, and take cues from that. In Southern California, there's a large marine influence, so there's a lot more you can do with gardens. Once you get inland, it's a lot hotter, a lot drier, but still there's a lot that can be done. Again, depending on soils and how much water retention there is. And if you have visited Carrizo Plains after a super bloom, know that just simply adding water, you can make a lot of things happening. I hope none of you need any encouragement to go visit Mount Burdell, but we use the oak woodland sort of as our iconic ecosystem for the Northern California. And then for the Northwest, we chose this wonderful preserve outside of Portland, Camasia Ecological Reserve. And here we see the Oregon oaks and native wildflowers there. And from that, we use the message of garden where you are. And so there are 4, for this presentation anyway, there are 4 gardens that match up with each of those locations. From Southern California, we chose this garden overlooking the coast with a carex lawn. These are native carex panza, which works as a great lawn substitute. It's obviously not coastal chamise or chaparral, but it's the idea of the open areas around the house. For inland valleys, I love this really dry stack stone wall that's sort of echoing the rocks and the mountains beyond. They're native oaks here that the garden has incorporated, but These are mostly plants from Australia and South Africa, other summer dry climates, as we will talk about. For the Northwest, we chose this particular garden at Bellevue Botanic Garden. This is their demonstration garden for no water. A lot of plants we can recognize. We see alliums and grasses, there's berberis, there's some lavender. Plants that there in Washington require almost no water in the summer, but with much more lushness. That's, again, the idea. They have a deeper system to work with there. I'm going to touch a little bit here about some maps. Part of this presentation is me trying to explain the summer dry climates with maps and things, and I will take a break in about 10 minutes or so. If there are any questions about the science, I'm happy to try to answer them. And in the second half of the presentation, I'll go more into the plants themselves and the garden using plants, and with a lot of native plants. But right now, I want to talk about the climate classifications across the world and what makes them similar. Vladimir Kopin created these biomaps about 100 years ago or so, and it actually got all the various climates in the world to 31 different climates. It really was an attempt to have mapping biomes. But as you can see, there are 5 different regions that share very similar climate classifications. Commonly they're called Mediterranean, but we're going to expand on that today. It's not, they're all summer dry. In the Köppen classification, we see 3 different classifications, CSA, CSB, and CSC. Each one slightly different. All are mild temperate, and all have dry summers. But what difference is how cold they are or how much rain they get. And it's really a sub-classification that really helps us understand the ecotopes that really have come from these bioregions. I found a description in Wikipedia of calling ecotopes the smallest ecologically distinct landscape feature that we find in a classification systems. The vegetation zones really, of course, they mean they're plants. And gardens that share common ecotopes often share plants that are adapted and climate tolerant and thus sustainable. These are the criteria for selecting plants for the new book, which at the core really is the exploration of which plants from those 5 summer dry ecotopes are adapted to each other. We will, and maybe even this evening, have a discussion about habitat and more native plants and how plants from other regions might or might not be invasive. And we need to consider the ecosystem services, but that's the art of gardening. And it's why gardeners need resources like the Summer Dry Project, I think, to help find those adapted plants. No surprise, gardeners tend to love plants. And with the Summer Dry Project, we want to make sure people pick the right ones that are climate adapted. But let's move from the ecologically distinct landscapes of those ecotopes to ecotones. Drill down to the regional microclimates, and we'll consider our gardens as ecotones and start visualizing how all gardeners can help with the goal of resiliency. I think we must. What's an ecotone? Well, it's a border zone where ecological systems meet and mingle, sometimes forming new communities. Well, I think that's exactly how you could describe a garden, a new community. Our sensibilities can and must model ecosystems in those small parts of the earth that are under our care. Sure, we can have fun with plants from similar ecotopes, but when we mingle in these new communities we're going to call gardens, those plants must be climate adapted. There's too much at stake now with the climate change to do otherwise. Gardeners must be stewards of the land, and as stated in our mission purpose, attuned to the local environment on behalf of all creatures. Every small act we do adds resiliency. I would argue your garden is not your own. It's your interface with the earth. We are all stewards for the garden earth. I'll point out this garden is all California native plants. As gardeners, we have a distinct responsibility these days to think globally and act locally. As gardeners, I would argue we not only have that obligation to planet Earth, we have an obligation to society to model a behavior that's socially responsible. Gardening is valuable, and it's a thrill just knowing that every small act we do makes a difference. Gardens matter. And as Doug Tallamy said about gardens, they are nature's best hope. I really enjoy talking about ecotones as applied to gardens. It's a natural progression of understanding climate tolerant gardening from the biomes of those Köppen vegetation maps to ecotopes and to ecotones, and then down to our own little microclimates, which is how we must incorporate all the concepts of naturalistic gardening to include biodiversity and watersheds wrapped around green infrastructure, wildlife corridors, and urban oases, where ecological systems meet and mingle, sometimes forming new communities. Our gardens are ecotones, and we are part of the whole. But we don't really expect our gardens to be climate classifications. We want them to have their own special plants, beyond whatever endemic natives that might be locally adapted. But we certainly want them to be climate tolerant, to fit comfortably into the local microclimates and connect wild nature to our built landscapes. There's no getting around that most of us live in metropolitan areas, which almost always need supplemental water. So we must plan for green infrastructure that connects gardens to the ecosystems, those ecotones that are our gardens. Before we go on to discuss more specific plants and garden examples and how we can integrate gardens into the green infrastructure, I want to show another series of maps, more specifically about the regional differences within our summer dry climate across the Pacific coast, our part of the world, which is considered a much broader than a typically Mediterranean. Oops, I didn't want it to go that fast. This is a wonderful series of maps I sourced from the Pacific Bulb Society, who is, as you can see, the summer dry regions of the world are not simply the Mediterranean. They're extended vastly in the Far East, in the steppes of Asia, lots of Western Asia and Eastern Europe there in the steppes. And then noticeably in the West Coast, much of the Northwest is summer dry. Not as dry as California, but still very much summer dry. The Bulb Society then takes those summer dry climates into 28 different ones. It can be a little bit tedious to try to look at them all. I'm a sort of a map geek. I like seeing these references. I like seeing how they're divided up basically between how cold they get and how much water they get. I'm not sure why they chose in these maps to use summer rainfall as one of their criteria, but nonetheless, I pick an example from cities that are actually in California, and on this map we see Riverside. You jump to there we go. On this map of 28 sub microclimates, Los Angeles and Riverside are both listed, but they're not even side by side. They're in, they're almost side by side geographically, and we in the Bay Area know once you go 20 miles a different direction, you can be in an entirely different microclimate. So it's really important that we understand that these are really important differences, and plants we may want to garden with in one region don't work even 20 miles away. So it's really important to get that. Over the 35 years that I've been photographing gardens across the West, I began hearing people talk about Mediterranean garden and Mediterranean plants. But after an initial flush of wisdom and understanding, the more I traveled from Albuquerque and Denver, Seattle, San Diego, the less I understood about what people really meant when they said they had a Mediterranean garden. Certainly a plant or two of Mediterranean origin, an olive tree incorporated into any dry temperate garden, does not make the garden itself Mediterranean. I think among gardeners, the term Mediterranean has become fairly well understood as one adapted to a climate that's wet in the winter with a relatively few extended periods of frost and summers that are particularly hot and dry, fostering those gardens that are designed around outdoor living, using plants living happily with the heat and dry weather of any given microclimate. However, I've noticed over the years of photographing gardens that many in the public understand the concept of a Mediterranean lifestyle without really understanding the climate and the vegetation and all the different plants that are adapted to it. For a lot of non-gardeners, the Mediterranean garden and the Mediterranean lifestyle is simply outdoor living, maybe a hot, dry summer day under a mata with some Spanish sausages, maybe some French cheeses, some Italian bread, Greek olives, and oh, of course, that California wine. That's all the Mediterranean lifestyle, but it's not all Mediterranean plants is what we can use. So as a journalist and a gardener who was still really learning to appreciate the summer dry climate after growing up in Virginia, where I came from, where in the humid mid-Atlantic, where people have lawns mowed just to beat back nature, I felt it was my job, as I learned about gardening, to find and show a new aesthetic. Gardens are different here, they must be different here, and it really became my job to illustrate them. I hope you all know this is one of my favorite all-native plant gardens. It's really a lovely site. But for many of us, even in the beginning of this century, most garden publishers treated all of the West Coast as simply a temperate region, seldom addressing the climate, and more often than not, marveling that gardens could overcome dry summers with water-sucking plants popular in England and the East Coast. But slowly, as outdoor living and the California and Mediterranean lifestyle began to creep into popular culture, Mediterranean-style gardens began to appear in books and magazines, and often associated at that time with wineries and olive trees. But more and more, we see gardens like this, where people are actually, this is an entirely created garden. These trees were even brought into this place with the effort to create a Mediterranean California garden. Gardeners began to realize how much easier it was to work with plants adapted to the climate, and indeed, how wonderful they look as an authentic connection to the outdoors and the native aesthetic. And now I really think we are thinking of gardens as ecotones and a new role for gardens. So it's my job, I think my job explicitly as a photojournalist, to help gardeners see a new aesthetic and create those ecotone gardens. Another great California garden. Whoops, I want you to relish. I want to show that one off. Hang on, there we go, okay. It's an opportunity to mention that when I talk about summer dry gardens, it's really meant to talk about the climate and not gardens that get no water in the summer. I can give an entire separate lecture about water for gardens and the need we have as a culture to honor water and put it to its highest use. For many, many reasons, we need to have supplemental water in the summer for our municipal and urban ecotones, not the least of which is hydration for fire issues, but just to keep the plants healthy. The battle for water rights really is legendary and it's still ongoing, especially here in California. And the amount of water gardens deserve is most certainly debatable, but we should not debate that it requires some water in the urban environments for the sake of the plants, amidst all the pavements and the heat, as well as the lifestyle of the people. So it's really the reason we undertaken this whole project to encourage an ecological approach, specifically describing and illustrating climate-tolerant plants in garden settings, where we can celebrate and honor the summer dry climate, and I would argue, honor and celebrate native plants, and redefine beauty holistically in that. Increasingly now, in the face of the obvious climate change, it's more important that the media show solutions, and that's really become our mission. So as you said earlier, we've got the website, we've got the WCLS database, and are trying to become a constant source of information for folks. I want to take this break here at this point. I will be talking next half a lot more about plants specifically and how I've tried to include a lot of photos of native plant gardens to show, get people inspired by that. But if there are any questions here as far as the science or that background, this is a good point to take them, but I'm also very willing and eager to take questions at the end too. But Kristen, did you see any questions come in?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to unmute themselves and just ask a spontaneous question, that would be great. If no one does, then we'll continue on with the rest of the program. There is a question. Will this recording be made available after the fact? Yes, it will be posted on the YouTube channel.
But I think it's only for 30 days. I don't want my presentations being permanently on a site.
Yes. You can talk to Anne about that afterwards. There will be a form you would need to fill in to allow it to be up in any case.
Right.
So
Anyway.
that's negotiable.
Yeah. But let's say if there are more questions about the science, we can hold those for later. Let's go into the plants. I don't want to over, go
Yes,
too.
we can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'm going to talk about the various categories that we included in the book. The book is mostly a plant book, more of an encyclopedia. Those of you who know the original East Bay Mud book, it's the same concept. The first part is we cover some themes and design ideas, but not a lot of how-to. But for tonight, I will talk about a few of those themes. In fact, I've used these particular photographs to illustrate them. The one in the upper left will be about plants. The upper right, I'll talk about firescaping. The lower right, I'm going to talk about carbon sequestration. And the lower left, talk about water and water capture. And actually, water, I want to really bring up the work of Obi Kaufman. I hope many of you know Obi. He's lectured at Marin several times. I've met him a couple of times, and I really admire his work. And so I like to think what I do is similar to this. I'm going to try to read it. I can't read it quite because the thumbnails are over the view. But here, I've got my list here. Obi says, my work operates in what can be called a post-environmentalist world, where the arguments to pure logic are sublimated as we moved on from merely toiling to prevent degradation to now greater visions wrapped up in better stories about how we mitigate catastrophe. Two opposing truths are relevant. One, the amount of biodiversity still extant is a miracle. And two, we're already in the bottleneck of cascading effects toward a permanently altered biosphere. In my own daily practice of making sprawling books of California nature, I aim to balance the discourse of this big picture stuff, all the while concentrating on the smallest geographically specific niche truths upon which the living world relies. Those smallest geographically specific niche truths upon which the living world relies, those are gardens. That's how we gardeners must adapt to this future. These are niche truths, and we have some control over that and some obligation with that. I think all of us here today, whether we're gardeners or not, need to advocate for gardens. Gardens matter. In the built landscape of cities and suburbs, gardens make our lives habitable. They make ecosystems habitable for all the creatures, from birds and bees to mushrooms and mycorrhiza. Well, I've been through some of those maps, and I'm going to go now to the more garden-oriented photos that maybe we'll have a discussion. Most of the book really is the plant book. Nora Harlow, who is my co-author and was the writer on this, has described some key considerations such as the firescaping and carbon capture, soil sequestrations, and invasive plants. Let's go on and talk a little bit about those now. One of the most important things for me really was talking about water and water capture. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about different ways that can be built into green infrastructure, and how, in my opinion, that's really what we talk about, the green infrastructure that politicians are talking about. It's all well and good to have alternative energy and have a broadband access and better roads and all that. But to me, a green infrastructure has to have green in it. And we must allow for greenery. And not just in the West, talk about water and how we use water efficiently. This is a bioswale. It's at UC Davis. I included the picture of the car in it, so it had a little bit of a reference point of where this is and what its function is to take rainwater before it goes into Puda Creek and have it cleaned and percolated. Bioswales do that. I'm seeing that increasingly more common in specs for even larger garden installations. But the concept, of course, is the water goes off the paved surfaces and percolates into the ground. That's fundamental concept of what we really must think about when we talk about green infrastructure and gardening for the planet. It ought to be mandated. Actually, regulations coming through the pipe for California to require on-site water to be kept on site from any new buildings. We know the groundwater has been depleted in the Central Valley. I think I've heard it's gone down 40 feet. So even our native oak trees, which I've heard argue, well, they can handle a 500-year drought. Well, sure they can, but not when the humans have already depleted the groundwater, the ground table by 40 feet. So we really need to get the water back into the ground. I'll show a few more examples of that with home gardens, but it's another great concept. Cisterns. This is the backyard of Judy Adler. Some of you may know, an environmentalist, an educator over in Walnut Creek. This is her backyard. She has 3 large cisterns just collected by gravity from the roof. These are connected and they fill up. And what I'm learning about the water collection for cisterns is to use it when you get it. I used to totally dismiss the idea of rain barrels, and why would you collect 55 gallons of water for the summer when plants don't need it then? Well, we should collect water and use it now. The climatologists are telling us that we're going to have increasingly big storms further apart. And our plants need the water when it's in the winter, when it's expected to be winter wet. So if we collect 5,000 gallons of water, we use it in the winter. If it's dry for 3 weeks, you should use the water then, not save it for the summer. The plants don't need summer water to survive. They may need it to thrive in some of our built landscapes, but they don't need them to survive. And so it's really important that we start capturing water and holding it for our gardens. Oops, I'm not going to jump to that one right away. This one is a more and more commonly called rain gardens. I've kept in the photograph the roof line, so you can see what happens here is the water is collected from the roof and percolates down through the front of the yard. This particular designer has used some nice gravel ornamentally, but the water flows from one end of the garden to the other and is allowed to percolate into the ground before it gets off into the street and runs off into the storm sewers. This garden is in the Woodland Hills in Southern California, and I think a lot of us heard about so many trees that died in Southern California during the last drought because well-meaning people thought they shouldn't add any water to the trees. Well, the trees could survive if they had some groundwater, but everything is paved over. The rain has no chance to get into the ground. So it's really vital as we think about what green infrastructure is supposed to be and how we create urban oases and have plants that are adapted and native plants that are adapted. They require water in the winter, and that water needs to get into the soil in the winter. So we really need to have rain gardens to get that water into the ground. I've included this one large installation. These are cisterns that are covered with a ground cloth, which is the local code, the building code. They have to be covered, but these are connected cisterns. I mentioned a few minutes ago the environmentalist Judy Adler in Walnut Creek. She was pretty fundamental in helping change the building codes so that people could install these high-end cisterns without going through a property tax reassessment. What often happens to those of you who own houses, particularly if you own a house for a long time, if you want to do a remodel or an addition, it gets reappraised. And so I did help Judy a little bit with a specific horticulture on this, but the concept is we don't want to penalize people for doing the right thing of putting in large scale cisterns and then having their property tax go up. So this just shows what can be possible. Another wonderful thing that I've really got to now appreciate with the rain gardens, I work a lot with this group in LA called the Urban Water Group. This is a rain garden. The water from this roof goes into the depression there. You can see around the carex and there's Ostrom area and some other plants there. Very effective, but what's really, really effective is when the next door neighbor liked what they saw, wanted to have a rain garden and put one in themselves. This garden is brand new, it hasn't grown in yet, but what the aha moment for me was when I saw these two gardens side by side on the same street with large mature street trees. It's like, well, why doesn't everyone do this? Couldn't you imagine the whole street being collecting water and getting it into the ground? I think this is part of what we really must think about as green infrastructure in the future. Designing our built landscapes, designing our cities to work with nature. Just imagine this whole street capturing the water and putting it into the ground instead of having it run off. It's really, it's happening, and it's really nice to see it happening. And in happening specifically, as Obi Kaufman said, those geographically specific niche truths. These are the gardens. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other design concepts in the book with firescaping. One of the key ingredients with firescaping is keeping at least 5 feet away from the house with hardscape, and then using plants that are adapted to resist fire. Here there are a lot of succulents, and the other key concept is if there are trees, to make sure they are pruned away from the house. Another thing with firescaping, a lot of people like to have the green concept of a lawn, but we can't afford ecologically or even financially the cost of water. But here is a carex lawn. These are mixed characters. There's Panza, Pregracilis, and Texensis, I think, are all 3 mixed in this particular mix. And it also acts as a rain garden. The roof does fill this in the winter, but it provides a fire break, and it also gives the idea of a green looking lawn without being a lawn. We included this one picture in the book. We talk about carbon sequestration. This is actually a native plant garden, and we love the fact that it's all covered with plants. With putting carbon back into the ground, plants eat carbon and they put it into the ground. So it's a pretty complex science around it, but the point is to try to have as many plants as you can of diverse types for root depth and keep the carbon back into the ground. Next, we'll go right back into talk about the plants. This is the book, I say, is a plant book. And we've tried to show plants that are adapted to gardens. I've tried to pick a number this evening that are native plants. Here's the rhamnus coffeeberry, which really is quite well adapted to gardens. It's one of those broadleaf evergreens that people talk about in English style gardens, but it's a California native. This particular garden pruned it up so they could have some light underneath it. They could have some more wildflowers and another type of plants, but it's still based on the California native and understanding how it can be used, and with maintenance, how you can make it work. One of my favorite plants that I discovered used in landscape in the book was this quail bush, the Atriplex lentiformis. It's a silver foliaged large shrub. I've seen it used commonly in sort of gardens that are supposed to be habitat gardens and wild and somewhat rangy. The common name of this plant is quail bush. It's a great plant for habitat, but if it's put into a garden and pruned and taken care of, it can really become an ornamental feature. It looks great here with the blue ceanothus. This is not a totally native plant garden. Obviously, the daffodils are a giveaway there, but it goes to show how our California natives really can blend in with all types of plant combinations. And increasingly, we're finding, I think in our book, more than 40% of the entries turned out to be California natives. There are more and more that are available in the trade, and it's really important to understand how to use them. It's another, for example, Fremontodendron. Most of you probably know garden. It can be a huge shrub. It can get out of bounds, but for a habitat in a small garden, you can find cultivars such as this one with Ken Taylor, which is a small one. It's more prostrate, still has the beautiful butter flowers. It looks great cascading over boulders and can even be a ground cover. But adds that native plant look to a garden without having the huge shrub. Again, that's for the concept of the book being encyclopedic, that it shows which cultivars are really well adapted. I assume all of us love Manzanita. It's a great garden plant. I have some in my garden. I have, which is about 20 some years old now. My Manzanitas are looking like this. You limb them up. They can't support, as they get older, they can't support all the leaves they make, so they die back. But if you prune the dead branches back, you reveal this beautiful structure. And taken as a garden ornament, they become wonderful. I don't know this garden. I'm photographing at the back door, looking out at the pool, and clearly they planted two at one point. I don't know which one this is. I'm imagining it might be a densiflorus. I'm not sure, but they've kept care of it. They've limbed it up. They've taken out all the dead wood and revealed the structure of it. Manzanitas are just fantastic garden plants, and they don't take any garden water. They look a little better with some, but they don't take any water. Here's a shot where I like to talk about using the right California plant for the right place. We all know that, California is a huge floristic province, that one plant from one area doesn't work for another. A redwood tree from the coast is not going to be well suited for, the Central Valley unless it gets lots of water. But I would argue it's not because it starts off as a coastal tree. There are other trees that need to be in the right place. A Joshua tree is not drought tolerant in Death Valley. You have to pick the right plant for the right place. So this particular photograph is showing Ceanothus Valley Violet. This is taken in UC Davis. They've developed this particular Ceanothus to be appropriate for the hotter inland climates. Finding a lot of people who want to do the right thing with native plant gardens, sometimes they'll go to a big box store and just find whatever Arctostaphylos or Manzanita or Ceanothus is being sold there and assume it's good for their garden. It's not. We need to, of course, here I'm talking to Native Plant Society, and when I give this lecture to others, I really advocate for Native Plant Societies to go to the plant sales in your local region or your independent nursery in your local region to find these plants, to talk to the people who know which Ceanothus is adapted to your climate, or which Arctostaphylos or which tree. It's really important to have success to choose the right plant. And there are lots of plants that are adapted. The native plants do need some care. They don't just appear. They need some care. I love this combination of the Arctostaphylos, the Ceanothus, and the redbud. This was taken years ago. This is an old picture I have from Rancho Santa Ana, which has now been renamed the California Botanic Garden. But so it's not often that the redbud and the Manzanita are blooming the same time, especially with the Ceanothus, but it was this year, that year I was there. And this photo has just become such a great example of understanding shapes and sizes of plants, how big they get, and how they can look well together. It takes some planning. Gardening is an artistic act. It's a performance. It changes, every year, but it's a blast, and it's really, you can make things happen if you've planned for them. The tiny little backyard native plant garden. And the key to having a garden with native plants, again, is to treat it like a garden. Cut things back, move them, have things of the right scale, and choose ones that look well together. Sometimes that's trial and error. Gardeners know things are going to die. Some things get too big. Some things just don't. They worked across town at your friend's place, but didn't work in your backyard. So gardening is something you have to keep a track of, and it does change. But it's really a thrill. It's really something we all need to do. And this is Charlotte Torgovitsky's garden. I hope many of you know. I'm sure you know Charlotte, but I don't know how well you know her garden. It's really surprising to me that this was chosen for the cover of the book. We had some other choices that we thought might be show more trees and shrubs, but the publisher really liked having all the color. And this is Charlotte is a neighbor of mine. We both live on what's called Cherry Hill here in Novato, and so I know her garden very well. I've been able to photograph it over the years. And I'm laughing, smiling right now, just thinking of all the gardens I photographed all across the West Coast. my neighbor's garden was the cover of the book. But it's a great garden. It's not all just native plants, but her garden is exposed to the street. It's almost entirely deer-proof, and she's experimented with it over the years to create a really wonderful site. I want to encourage all gardeners to take advantage of going to public gardens. There's some great ones across the West. I think I've picked ones here for California that are really great places to go. This is the Los Angeles Natural History Museum. Some of you may know Carol Bornstein, the great native plant designer and expert. She was instrumental in helping to design the garden, not this part of it. This is an older part that was first designed. Carol was brought in for the pollinator garden and the native plant garden, but it's a great place to go just to see an urban setting. I really like this particular photograph because the Parkinsonia trees with their yellow flowers are great with the blue agave, but it's just a place to go to see really good combinations. The Huntington Library has really great public gardens. They have a new area of it, new in the past 10 years or so, if you haven't been there in a while, between the library and some of their meeting rooms. They have a long corridor of various garden rooms that use a lot of different combinations of new cultivars of summer dry adapted plants. It all culminates here at the very end of that promenade, what they call the California Celebration Garden, of plants that are really adapted to California. This garden changes every few years. This is now probably 3 years old, and I go to the garden, Huntington, at least once a year. So I know these Nolinas and Euphorbias and Carex, this combination is still not there now, but it's a great inspiration to go to. In San Francisco, I like to kid my gardening friends in San Francisco who say there's a summer dry climate. I think it's more of a subtropical cloud forest, but it's still summer dry. The cloud forest effect of all the fog that comes in allows significant and measurable water. Those of us who here maybe live in West Marin, we know the fog is measurable in water. I think we're all concerned at the warming climate and the warming oceans. There's less fog to be manufactured every year, and it's an ongoing question of how much fog, how much gardeners can rely on fog, but it's still much different than the inland areas, such as this. Ruth Bancroft Garden, one of my favorites. I thought I knew it fairly well before I started getting involved with the project, but what I discovered is because the garden is so mature, the plants can be seen at scale. So in the book and all the work I do with the WUCLS project, I try to show gardens that are mature so that people have an idea of how big the plants get. You can imagine getting a small 1 gallon plant at a plant sale thinking it's, you've heard about how great it is and you want to plant it, and find out 5 years or 10 years later, it's so big. So the Bancroft Garden is really a great inspiration because the plants are big. That native plant garden I showed earlier, I said this, that was at the Ruth Bancroft Garden. They have a really nice section of natives there with plants from all across California. The Davis Arboretum is another great source. Increasingly in the past 10 or 15 years, the whole department there has become much more focused on summer dry climate gardens. They have what's called the Gateways program at the entrances to the campus. There's now planted out with plants that are really adapted to the climate. This particular photograph was taken in the Ruth Storer Garden. It's a garden I've been photographing for 25 years, and they try out different plants there. This particular day, obviously I'm amazed that the roses are in bloom. Their garden gets watered twice a month, and some roses haven't worked, some have, but it's a really great place to go to find plant combinations that really are adapted to the more hot inland areas. And then all of us must know the Tilde Regional Park's Botanic Garden because it's all California native plants. And it's such a treasure because it's so old and the plants are mature, and you can get a sense of how the garden is maintained with combination of shrubs and grasses and trees. It's really an inspiration for native plant gardeners. And I would argue not just for native plant gardeners, for all gardeners. We shouldn't be thinking about, and say, I know from my book that we're talking about the whole plant palette across the globe. And California natives are equal to any of them. It's really fun to see on my Instagram account, California natives being used in South Africa or Australia, and seeing these plants that I just, they're treasures, they're special things to find, but increasingly they're much more available in the trade. So I think it's part of gardening must be a solution to resiliency. It's a way we will adapt. We must adapt. I think we have to think of the whole planet as a garden. Sure, we should have wilderness areas and areas put aside for nature, but that will be a conscious choice that we humans decide to do, like a garden. It'll be a part of our garden that we've left for wildlife. We need to think about the garden, the earth as a garden, and be stewards and take care of it. So that's really why I want to keep doing these talks for the Summer Dry project, because in our part of the globe, we have a very distinctive climate. It's very well adapted to plants that look great in gardens if you pick the right ones. And I said that the book is only the latest manifestation of that. If you wanted to buy the book, you can go to the summerdry.com website. You see the homepage there. You can go there and buy an autographed copy of the book, or you can go to an independent bookstore or online to find it. But that's where to get the book. But it's really is a good resource. We have a lot of blog posts there. We do monthly newsletter. Of course, the WUCL's database I mentioned earlier, and the Instagram account is really a blast because it's fun to see. Even the hashtag Mediterranean Garden. When you see that hashtag, you don't see often Mediterranean gardens. You see someone who is having a lovely lunch in an outdoor garden in Tuscany. It's not really about gardens; it's about the lifestyle. So but it's fun to see, and it's really a fun Instagram account for those of you who do that. It'd be fun to see you there. This is my patio slide. This is where I'll close. Hopefully, there's some questions that come in. I can stop sharing, Kristen, if you want. We can see who is on. So I think I'll just stop sharing at this point and
Okay.
see where we
Thank you,
are.
Saxon.
So,
And we will, by the way, for those of you who joined later, we'll be putting up the chapter election ballot again, so you'll have a chance to vote if you didn't at the beginning of the program. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to ask any questions of Saxon, you can just unmute and go ahead and speak.
Oh, hi. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Oh, hi. My name is Michael. I also live in Nevada. I live in Hamilton Field, the old Air Force Base. And Saxon, I have a question. First of all, wonderful presentation. Photography is beautiful. But I am torn between being truly focused on native plants versus having plants that are summer dry. You mentioned Australian plants earlier on. Can you explain what you think the priority should be for us?
Well, I can't speak for every person. I love plants. I love plants from all over the world. And I think there are lots that are adapted to our summer dry climate. I also love natives. Most of my garden is probably native. I live, I have a large property, so I can have lots of trees. But I have lots of non-native plants. Just think about daffodils or lavender or all kinds of things that are not native. Grasses are one of my favorite things. I have a lot of bunch grasses I have a lot of California ones, but I've done 2 other books on grasses, so I like to incorporate them. And as an example, I've talked to entomologists about the bunch grasses, and specifically the native ones are great. There's all kinds of them that are adapted to gardens, but all bunch grasses are host for insects. You need overwintering bunch grasses and all bunch grasses put on deep roots and pull water into the ground. So it's some of it is aesthetics. If you have a plant that you like the look of it and it's adapted, then you should use it. I think we should favor native plants when we can with the ecosystem services. We're learning more and more that a lot of plants and insects have co-evolved, and if they don't have the native plants, you won't have the native insects. It's way beyond, butterflies. There's all sorts of insects that have evolved with native plants. Unfortunately, I may get in trouble with Native Plant Group. We have so screwed up the climate. There's so little native habitat left that almost any habitat we create is better than nothing. And so we've already experiencing what some people call the insect
Apocalypse.
Apocalypse, thank you. But we've already lost billions of insects. And so to try to create a native habitat to bring them back, I think is foolish. I think we much more important should have gardens that create shade and wildlife corridors for the birds and the critters, and include as many plants with ecosystem services as we can. I mean, oak trees, for instance, are they're the high part of the food chain. They offer more ecosystem services than any other plant, but how many folks can have an oak tree in their garden? They get big. I have several dozen in my yard, but I have a large property, so I can get away with it. It's really a matter of personal taste. I would encourage you to use native plants when you can, but if you love lavender, if you love herbs and you want thyme in your garden, you don't be afraid to use it. I think the important thing is to know what your water budget is and to use it wisely. Don't start bringing in plants that require a lot of water. All plants need water the first year or two, but just find the balance. Find the balance.
I might just interject that I think the key is to avoid plants that are known to be invasive. Of course, we run the risk always of introducing things, especially new to the trade, that might become invasive after a period of time. So we just need to be alert to that and make sure that we don't allow things to get out into the wildlands that might impact the native populations there. So yes, I think just has to be done consciously and carefully. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that was a wonderful program, Saxon. Thank you very much. And I hope, let's see, here's the question in the chat. Can you give some guidance about how to find plants that are both fire safe and low water?
Well, that's
a complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Issue.
A lot of uninformed bureaucrats are getting involved with some of that, but there's also a lot of really good work happening. We do need. I argued earlier about water for gardens. We can. I remember hearing years ago a newscaster or some news headline saying 44% of all urban water goes to gardens, as if that's a problem. Because you can argue about how much water goes to gardens, but the catch there was urban gardens. Urban areas get 10% of the water we capture as a culture, as a society. Most of the water we capture goes to agriculture, which we can argue is good or bad, but and some of the water we capture does help replenish the streams and rivers, but only 10% of the water we capture goes to the urban environment. So if we use 44% of that to keep the trees alive, I don't think that's a problem. I think we just have to use it wisely. I think we must use it wisely. We, as I said in the presentation, we're in this built landscape with pavement and buildings, and we can't expect to have any kind of gardens, native or not, if we don't add water. And for fire safety, part of that is simply hydration. A lot has been shown, I think, even with native plants, that if they're properly hydrated, they have as much potential for fire break as anything else. The question is how much hydration, how much water do we have to allow for that? I think anyone who's really close to the urban wildlife interface, as most of us are here in Marin, are somewhat in danger. I mean, we get one of those firestorms where the winds blow embers a quarter of a mile. There's not a whole lot we can do. We can say, oh, we'll cut all the vegetation around our own house, but it's going to come from a quarter mile away. So I don't think we should be sacrificing our own well-maintained, hydrated plants around our houses to thinking that will make them fire safe. Yes, within 5 feet of a house, you shouldn't have anything near your house that an ember could catch onto. You shouldn't have any trees of any kind that overhang your house. But I think there, beyond that, I advocate for gardens. I advocate for healthy gardens. And I say where I live, Kristen knows my house. I'm doomed. If there's a big firestorm, there's so many oaks around where I live, and I live in a wood shingle house with a wooden deck. So, I'm not. I can't really. It's a choice I make. It's a choice I make. So.
And here someone asks, is it safe to add swales on a hillside?
Oh, that's a great question. It has to be done very carefully, obviously, because of the natural runoff on a hillside. You don't want to create erosion. And so it depends really how steep your hillside is. But if you have a hillside of any slope at all, a swale is probably not good. Probably the soil is more rocky and can't accept the water. Most of the water that runs down goes into flat areas that can hold the water. So I would stay away from swales on hillsides. I've read with permaculture practices, some folks talk about a serpentine water course going through a backyard, through a hill, so the water goes back and forth and has rocks in the bottom of those swales so it can percolate. But to try to build a big enough depression, a bioswale to hold water, I think it'd be a mistake on any sort of steep slope. It would you risk runoff and erosion.
Okay.
We have
Well,
a question about what about clay soils? Do you have any specific plants that will work well with those?
I'm so glad someone asked that question. I get that a lot. And I say, for those of you who have clay soil, you count your blessings because clay retains water. Many native plants are adapted to clay soil and they need clay soil. The problem is when clay gets totally dried out, it becomes brick and there's no water left. But I have clay soil where I live. I mulch a lot. So now my clay soil for the first 12 inches is no longer clay. So I would add mulch, just organic mulch regularly and let it break down. But clay, as I said, absorbs water. And a lot of plants are well adapted to that. So it's really, we have a section in the book about clay soils. And if your clay is right next to your house, it's been compacted from either building or years of cars driving over a driveway, whatever, it's a little bit different matter. But the native clay soil is really, it's a blessing.
Okay, we have a comment from Joan Pont. She says that Greg Rubin addresses low irrigation natives and fire safety in his book, and he's just published studies on fire mitigation. Are you familiar with that?
Oh yes, Greg is has published some good work. He's very active. He's in Southern California, and he has observed. He does native plant gardening for a living, and so he's observed gardens he's done over the years and which ones have survived various fires. And he's a huge advocate for the concept of hydrating plants, that natives can act as good as any other plant. Again, in a big firestorm, everything is going to burn. And so it's, what we hope for is the small fires that may start in your community and before it becomes a firestorm. If your own community is resilient and adapted and hydrated, the fire won't spread. If the fire becomes a storm, whether it's a native plant or a succulent, I've seen succulents burn in San Diego. I went to one story a number of years ago after a fire in San Diego, and the succulents burned. Some of them, they did help to a degree, but in a really inferno, we have to understand we can't prevent that. It's a choice we make by living anywhere near the wildlife interface.
There's lots of people that are showing their appreciation. They want to thank you for the excellent presentation and moving us forward and beyond the term Mediterranean. And very insightful, has given Michael Pace ideas for a hotel that he hopes to re-landscape with California natives. And another thanks from Michelle Dervise, who just likes to hear from you all the time.
And one question here, can you repeat the name and author of that book? I think that person is referring to the Doug Tallamy book.
Oh, Doug Tallamy?
I'm not sure.
Doug Tallamy has a number of books. Nature's Best Hope came out this year, as did his book about oaks only. But Doug Tallamy is, I think, our best advocate for naturalistic gardening and native plant gardening. The real, he's in Pennsylvania. So when he talks about native plants, he specifically talks about East Coast natives. So it's a little bit of a stretch to say his work applies to us, but his theories are spot on. He's widely regarded as, I'd say, the preeminent expert on gardening with natives. And say Nature's Best Hope is the most recent one. Bringing Nature Home is a book that he wrote about 5 or 6 years ago about the importance of bringing nature into your home for the sake of children, just to understand that nature is a part of us and is not a separate thing. We are nature. Anyway, Doug Tallamy can't go wrong with his work.
Great. Oh, book on fire safe and low water plants. I don't believe there is a book specifically on that.
Well, that was,
topic.
I mentioned Greg Rubin.
Greg Rubin.
I don't know the name.
R-U-B, yeah, R-U-B-I-N. He's co-written a couple of books, I think, as well.
He has a couple of books about native plant gardening. And I have
He's based in Southern California, but I think a lot of the principles apply here. Well, thank you very much, Saxon. That was a wonderful program, and I hope people will follow up and get your book and enjoy it and use it. And Anne, if you could put up the poll again, so there might be some people who didn't vote. We need to reach a quorum for the vote to be legal by bylaws. And so we will say goodbye to Saxon for now.
Okay, so if you haven't voted, didn't get a chance to vote before, please vote now. And otherwise, we'll bring this poll back next month if we don't get our quorum. Okay. Thank you very much. Kristen, did you have anything?
Thank you, everyone. No, I just hope everyone can join us for the December meeting. And in the meantime, enjoy the rain.
Yes.
So good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks.